Okay, I think we're live now. It's so exciting to actually be physically here. I know it's going to be very hard for people to settle down. Anyway, good evening and welcome. I'm Kate Markert and I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. And I am so thrilled to welcome you all. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm delighted to see those of you who are in front of me. And we're also delighted to welcome all the people who are joining us by Zoom tonight. And I just want to thank all of you for all of your ongoing support of Hillwood. I know many, many of you are members, and those of you who aren't will just rush out and become members because you know this is the coolest place ever to join. So as I know you know, as I begin most of our programming, I like to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And those, of course, are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands today, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home near us. So for those of you joining by Zoom, you know the drill. You can relax and make yourselves comfortable because there are no microphones or cameras that are on. You can submit your questions using the Q&A module. And whenever they cross your mind, and then we'll get to as many as we can, both from inside the room and from Zoom at the end of our conversation. Now, for those in the theater, I do ask you to keep your masks on. I really appreciate that. We have taken ours off so that you can actually hear us on stage. And the other thing I'll ask you that I haven't asked you for a very long time, do you know what I'm going to say? Very good. Silence your devices. Thank you so much. They know, they just see this and they're all trained. I know you all know that spring is an absolutely marvelous time to be at Hillwood. And I hope some of you will join us for the wonderful programs we have coming up in May. We have another one on next Monday night, May 2nd, with Alexandre de Vogüé, who is the manager and co-owner of the sensational Chateau de Vaux-le-Vicomte. He's going to be here, and he will offer insight into the fascinating history of that estate. And he's also going to talk about the complexities of running such an estate today. So I can empathize. Tickets in the theater, of course, are already sold out, but we would love for you to join by Zoom if you haven't already bought your ticket for here. And then on Saturday, May 7th, our director of horticulture is leading a native pollinator container garden workshop, which will be very cool. That'll be on site. And then on Thursday, May 12th, this is a really cool one coming up. This is Wilfred. Please join us for a virtual conversation about the incredibly beautiful portrait, which I hope you have seen, of Lloyd Patterson, and it's now in the mansion. It's just an exquisite portrait. So Wilfred is going to have a conversation with the owner, and there's a whole big story behind it, which I know you'll all enjoy. Then on Thursday, May 26th, really important program, we're doing a benefit concert for Ukraine that's performed by the Sunflower Ensemble, and you can attend in person and it'll be under the tent, or you can join us live stream. So I hope, even if you can't come, I hope you'll support it. These are Ukrainian musicians and their heart and soul is in this concert. So I hope you'll support that. All of the ticket sales and the donations, everything, the musicians and Hillwood, everything goes to support World Central Kitchen's relief efforts in Ukraine. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, New York Times best-selling author, Allison Pataki. Yay!
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Allison's newest novel, and I know many of you know it, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post, centers on who else but Hillwood's founder. And I'm sure that no one will be surprised that you can buy it in the shop. And I know many of you already have. So, and of course, you get a discount as a member. So Allison's novels include The Queen's Fortune, The Trader's Wife, The Accidental Empress, CC Empress on Her Own. She has also written a nonfiction memoir, Beauty in the Broken Places, and 2 children's books. Her novels have been translated into 20 languages. Wow. A former news writer and producer, she has written for the New York Times, ABC News, the Huffington Post, USA Today, Fox News, and other outlets. Allison graduated, no surprise, cum laude from Yale University with a major in English, and she spent several years in journalism before switching to fiction writing. A member of the Historical Novel Society, she lives in New York with her husband and her 3 daughters. Just like Marjorie Post said. Yeah. Allison, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. This is a pinch me moment in my career, but I get to come back here.
Well, we have lots of pictures of you with lots of people, so we're really, really thrilled.
Thank you.
So I want to start by really thanking you for writing this novel. And for coming and being here with us in Marjorie Post's home. As I'm sure you're aware, you are in a room of Marjorie Post's biggest fans and maybe your toughest critics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're all, I think I can say this on behalf of all of us, that we are really grateful that your book is putting her in a spotlight, and in a spotlight that we just do not have the reach that you do. So we're really grateful that you've been bitten by the Marjorie Post
that she
book.
Deserves, right? The spotlight she deserves.
And I have to say, I read a reviewer's copy ahead of time to make sure she's worthy of us. And your admiration for Marjorie Post really shines through in the book. And I'd love to start off by asking you, how did you come to know Marjorie Post, and what drew you to learn more about her?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining, and for everybody who's joining online. And there is so much, packed into that question, but I just have to start by saying that I came to know her and write about her, and as you very, very aptly said, was first bitten by her because of this place. And because of a beloved longtime family member of Hillwood, Nancy Harris, who was a former oral historian and volunteer here. And Nancy is joining from online right now, so she's out there. And I warned her that her ears would be burning tonight.
Yes, good.
But 6 years ago, I had written 3 books at this point. I'd written about Empress Sisi. I'd written about Peggy Shippen Arnold, Benedict Arnold's wife. And I had sort of carved out this niche for myself, leaving news and writing historical fiction about these fascinating leading ladies from history who, as you said, deserved the spotlight in the genre that I was writing, historical fiction. And Nancy Harris just said to me, when I met her through my mother-in-law, casually over brunch, she said, I've read a couple of your books. I guess she had enjoyed the books. And she said, what do you think about Marjorie Merriweather Post? And this was 2016. And I will be perfectly honest, and I'm so sorry for saying this now, but hopefully I've redeemed myself. I did not know much about Marjorie Merriweather Post.
You are not alone.
That word, I thought maybe the etiquette books, Emily Post somehow. I was like the Post name, or there are a lot of Post newspapers out there. Maybe that is somehow connected. And so Nancy just gave me the very juicy bare bones of the story, that she had worked here at Hillwood. Fascinating woman, referred to as America's Empress. She told me just about 4 very dramatic, juicy, sort of different love stories, 4 marriages, and that this was the heiress of the Post food empire. And she just said, you really should go to Hillwood. And she just kind of put that on the table. And I get tips, somewhat frequently, people who are giving great ideas for books. And I would sort of file them away in my head, but Marjorie Merriweather Post really just sort of, the story got its hooks in me, and I was very, very interested to learn more. So I began by just reading as much as I could. And at this point I had my first daughter, who was just a little baby at the time. I now have 3 daughters. It's been 6 years that it's taken me to get this book out, but I got to Hillwood. I fell in love with her story, as is probably not surprising to you at all. I fell in love with this place, this treasure trove of information on Mrs. Post. And I just, you know, as you said, there was just this very clear admiration for just a life so well lived and just so much ground covered over the course of the 20th century. This is probably sort of blasphemous to say in like the shrine to Marjorie Merriweather Post, but for those who don't know anything about her, I say, she's sort of like the Forrest Gump of the 20th century in that she was there on the front lines of history for every moment you know about, but you probably don't know the role she played. And, you know, built Mar-a-Lago, intended to leave it as the Winter White House. More fabulous clothing than Forrest Gump, but just a story that is just sort of reads like the stuff of legend. So it took me longer than any of my other books, but it was just really a labor of love. And I just completely fell in love with her story. And there's just so much there. And what I love about telling it through historical fiction is just that it can educate people about her life and bring them into this story and make them aware of these moments, but hopefully can be entertaining and accessible in a way that maybe a biography might be more intimidating or daunting. So
I think that's probably true. You do share an impressive amount of detail from Post's life throughout the novel. And by and large, you actually, you know, you get the story right. I'm curious as to how you balance fiction and history as a novelist, because I have to admit, when I wasn't even aware of quote historical fiction. I'm thinking that's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? So I'm just curious how you do that balance.
Totally. And that is such a challenge. And every book, it sort of shapes up differently because the process is different. And in the times when I've been writing about women who have been dead for 300 years, who don't have entire museums dedicated to their legacy and their history, there are more holes in the historical record, you know, would be fair to say. With Marjorie Merriweather Post, Hillwood, and you all here have done the work of making sure that it is very well documented and very well preserved and accessible to the public. So in some ways, that was a real gift as in my journey, which is I'm setting out to write historical fiction. You know, the history was there to form the bones of this story. And then what I'm doing as the writer of historical fiction is, you know, I wasn't in the room when Marjorie Merriweather Post and E.F. Hutton had, you know, X conversation on X day, but it's known that this happened and that this was the result of the conversation. And so what I'm doing then is to sort of go in as the writer and try to get at the emotional truth. So sort of how I heard it explained once was when you're writing historical fiction, you have the historical record and you have your story, that's the narrative that you're telling that is inspired by the historical record. And there's sort of like two rails of the train tracks. And sometimes, you know, you lay down the track, that's the history, and you know the dates and you know the characters and you know sort of the arc of where you're starting and where you're going. And then your story, as you then go in and write your book with the raw material that history has gifted you, sometimes runs very parallel and sometimes the story can take you off, you know, in different directions. But with this story, I decided very early on that I would be crazy not to stick to the historical record because it was just that good. The raw material from history was just that good. I didn't have to make up anything extravagant because everything that Marjorie was doing was more extravagant than you could even make up. So just the history, you know, made the bones for the story and was just sort of an incredible gift.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, as much as I know a lot of our docents, which wish every single day that Marjorie Post had kept a detailed diary. It's actually in a way really gratifying to hear your Marjorie Post dialogue. I think that emotional connection is really part of what makes historical fiction so captivating. I'd love to hear more about how you approach your characters' emotions.
Yeah. So I would say I did feel just an incredible affinity and an emotional connection to her as a woman and as a character. I was inspired by her. I admired her. I told you today, I wish I had a bracelet that said WWMD, what would Marjorie do? Just because I really liked her in a way that I don't know that I felt with that same intensity with my other leading ladies. I just really enjoyed basking in her presence. And so an incredible gift in the whole process was that even though she didn't have a journal or a diary, there were wonderful exchanges that were preserved. And, you know, for instance, her daughter, Dina Merrill, passed away very recently and spoke about her mother. And there's an incredible biography. It's not a Hillwood publication, but by Nancy Rubin Stewart.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Where Nancy Rubin, because she was writing a few decades ago, she seemed to have interviewed every grandchild, every child, every family member, every friend. And she had just really wonderful interviews and dialogues and snippets of conversations, and even just the amazing, you know, source material that you all provide to us with her handwritten notes and letters she's written to people. So I really did feel like, even though there wasn't one definitive journal, her down to earth, salty Midwestern style was evident. And, you know, she sort of had, you knew who Mrs. Post was, you know, her spirit was very evident in sort of what she did leave behind. And so then I just had fun exploring that, and really her voice and her character evolves quite dramatically. And we're starting with her, you know, in Battle Creek at the beginning of Serial City, USA, and she's a little girl, and then we're going up to the end of her life. So it was, the voice definitely changed, but as a woman, as a mother, just as someone who really admired her, I did feel that my interpretation, my offering of some of the emotional truths of her story were sort of easy to make that connection. And you have to have that in order to give 6 years of your life to a story and a character. Like, I don't write about women unless I feel that sort of kindred spirit with, or just this desire to really steep myself in their story.
Are there specific like character traits that you're looking for, or is each one different? They grab you.
Everyone is different. And the way I've come to each of my women, because this is my 9th book, every single one has come about with an entirely individual and unique sort of genesis. But I think what I'm looking for is women who lived through just remarkable circumstances, remarkable moments in history, and who sort of stepped up to become leading ladies in those moments and in their lives. And Marjorie Merriweather Post certainly did that.
Certainly fits that bill. Well, fiction allows us to imbue social norms of the past with a kind of modern sensibility. And unlike many women of her time, Post was trained, as we know, to competently manage her homes and the family business, of course, by her father. But she very much still felt constrained by societal expectations. So how did you, as a modern woman, wrestle with the social norms that you were writing about that are obviously quite different from today?
Yeah, I loved how C.W. Post said about his daughter, you could put her on a desert island and Marjorie would organize the grains of sand. And that was absolutely true. And, you know, other people said, had she been living in a different era, I would have wanted to vote for her for president. She would have run US Steel. She would have run Ford Motors. But because of the era in which she was living, there were just certain realities and obstacles that were going to be, you know, in front of her as a woman. But she lived through almost a century of history where that story of what it was to be a woman really did change and evolve. So, and sort of one way to look at it was sort of the prism of her role as she moved through the marriages and ultimately stepped into her own, you know, leading lady status. And so you look at the relationship with Edward Close, and it's Edwardian. It's Downton Abbey. You know, she's this young, naive bride where her husband has to sit for her on the board of directors, even though she is C.W. Post's heir, and she has been the one who's been schooled in C.W. Post's business acumen and has the brilliance. But that's just the way things were done, as he told her time and again. And then you see with E.F. Hutton and the, you know, things kind of open up a bit because you have the Jazz Age and you have World War I and you have the Great Depression. And so she's stepping more into these leadership roles with opening the food kitchen and with sort of things getting a little bit freer in the Jazz Age and in the Roaring 20s. And then where you really see this very dramatic shift is in the 30s, where you have Frances Perkins is in the cabinet, you have Eleanor Roosevelt as a very active first lady, and you have Marjorie Merriweather Post stepping up and saying, no more of this business of my husband sitting for me at the table with the board of directors. And for the first time in the 1930s, she takes the seat as the Post family member with her family's business, and really made history in the process. And you sort of rooting for her and cheering for her in that moment because it's so deserved. And it's so past time. And then you see after the Joe Davies marriage falls apart, there was this quote by one of her childhood friends, 3 times around the track, but you've come back to the Post. And for me, sort of how this took shape, because I've never written about a woman who divorced and remarried and divorced. I wrote about women who had very unhappy marriages, but because of the centuries in which they lived, divorce was just not an option. But with Marjorie Merriweather Post, you see this identity of she takes the man's name, then she comes back to the Post, and then she, and so 4 times. And so for me, ultimately, the great through line and the great love story of this tale is Marjorie Merriweather Post falling in love with her own voice and her own agency and her own identity. Because even though the marriages, foreign marriages do not end with the success that perhaps she had hoped for and wished for, and that maybe we root for as we're reading her story. It was ultimately a life that was filled with love and great things and beauty and friendship and family. And so for me, her role as a woman evolves, her role as an individual evolves, and ultimately it's one in which, she ascends into this amazing role as America's Empress, as the Duchess, as the Queen, as all these monikers that were affixed to her, rightly so. It was, she was a leader, and it took a few decades and it took some evolution, but she gets there,
Well, and she certainly was resilient.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's something I think we can all admire of her.
Absolutely.
Was that
Strong.
She wasn't knocked down for long.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm really happy to say the book is receiving a lot of attention, and I would actually love to know what you're hearing from fans, especially people who are just learning about Post and her story, and sort of what parts of the story are your readers responding to, and does any of this surprise you?
Yeah, this book has really connected with readers, and I think there are many reasons why, but I think people want to be inspired by great people, by great women, by strong women. And I think there's also something very transportive about this story. A lot of people have said it's just a wonderful sort of escape from the bad news, because she lived this wonderful life and this epic, beautiful life. And by and large, what people say, or what is the most surprising thing that people really sort of seem to be blown away by, is just what a disruptive figure she was in food, and specifically with bird's eye. And, I always say, if you own a refrigerator or a freezer, or you've ever had a frozen vegetable or a cup of orange juice in the winter, unless you live in Florida, then Marjorie Merriweather Post changed your life. She fundamentally changed the American way of life. I did not know that when I started out on this process. I loved that whole thing that was pulled directly from the history, where she said it was a great idea. The experts, including Ned Hutton and including the businessmen, said people didn't want refrigerators. They didn't want frosted foods. Exactly. And she said, I'm telling you, the American woman is ready for this. And she stuck to her guns, and it took a few years, but they acquired Birdseye, and it changed the company, and it changed America, and then it changed the world. And so that's the thing that most people, I cannot tell you how many people have said, every time I go to the grocery store now and I see Birdseye frozen foods, I think of Marjorie. Because I don't think many people think about, how did this happen? Like, why do we own fridges? Why do we have frozen foods? So she did that. And then I think another thing that people really love is they know maybe some of the homes, like they know Hillwood or they know Mar-a-Lago, but they didn't know that she was the force and the visionary behind that.
They don't.
And so People either say they knew the name, but they didn't realize how fascinating her life was, or they didn't know her name and they can't believe that they didn't know her name because of just how much she did. So, and it's also, it's American history, it's recent history. People also love the Dina Merrill connection. So, and the Russian time, mission to Moscow time.
Can I'd love to know just a little bit more about your process. Was there a scene or a chapter that you found most exciting or most difficult to write? And were there any like very exciting things or stuff that you wish was in the book that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah. So I told my editor pretty early on in the process, I said to her, you could write 15 different books about Marjorie and Meriwether Post, each with their own entirely unique story arc, each a full length book. There's just so much out there. And I don't want to write a book that's 1,000 pages because I don't think anyone would want to read that. So the challenge was to wrangle the historical record into a book and make it, not just information being downloaded, but make it a story that reads entertaining. So the most challenging and the most exciting is probably the same thing. It's probably the same answer for both, which is the 20s, the jazz age, because you have so much ground to cover in that era of her life. And I could have zoomed in on so many different aspects because that's when she's with the love of her life. She and E.F. Hutton are maybe or maybe not the inspiration for The Great Gatsby because of this life they're living on Long Island.
They're certainly the it couple.
They're the it couple. They're hanging out with Billy Burke and Flo Ziegfeld. They're building Mar-a-Lago. They are just, you could have gone into more. So I think for me, just the greatest challenge was to touch on all of these fascinating facts and details, but to keep the story going. Because she lived a long life and she was very busy. And every day of her life, she was very productive. So there was a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
And so that was the challenge.
Absolutely. Well, were there things that you really had hoped would make it into the book that somehow didn't?
No, I think I did try to get in
you
the
wove it all.
I think I tried to weave in what was really, really important, and then maybe just felt like, oh, if I had time, I could have delved in a little more, but kept moving.
Were there any aspects of her character that you recognize in yourself?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't we all like to say that we could see ourselves in Marjorie Meriwether Post? I don't have imperial jewelry yet, but that was not a touch point. But so when I started writing the book, I had one daughter. And when I published the book, I had 3 daughters. And like Marjorie Meriwether Post, my third pregnancy, I was convinced was a boy. I told you this. It felt different. I felt different. I was like, this is not the same as my 2 daughters. Found out it was a girl as I was finishing the book and writing about Marjorie being convinced that Nedinia was going to be Ned. And so then when it wasn't Ned, she named her Nedinia. I was like, well, Dave, we're not having Davinia. So sorry, art will not imitate life in that instance. But I just really, as I've said, I really admired her. And I think I sort of share, hopefully, what I seemed to see in her, which is this desire to just get the most out of every day. And just what I loved so much about her, there were many things, but she had obviously wonderful, incredible privilege, and she had a beautiful life. But what she did with that privilege, she was so purposeful and so intentional and so inspired. Always, I felt the most on fire as a human when she was serving causes bigger than herself. And I found that inspiring, and I hope to attack my life sort of in a similar way. And just, she inspires me, to be productive and to take whatever you have and to apply it to be purposeful and intentional about every day of your life.
Well, you really do get Marjorie Post. There's just no question about that. You've talked about how you're drawn to all these fascinating women in history. And I love that we, of course, have a portrait of Empress Elizabeth, which is in the exhibition. So that's, of course, one of the books. Who's next?
Oh, yes, very, very good question. About the Empress Elizabeth, though, about Cece, I just have to say, a reader pointed out, there was a piece of jewelry that Napoleon bought for Marie-Louise, which then would have gone to Desiree Clary, another one of my women, her daughter-in-law, who was, you know, a descendant of Napoleon's family, which then would have passed through Cece's hands as the Empress of the Habsburgs, which then ended up with Marjorie Merriweather Post. So this necklace has been through 4 of my books and 4 of my leading ladies, you know, European royalty and American royalty. And so that was amazing, the sisterhood of the traveling diamonds.
Exactly.
So that's pretty
fantastic.
cool. So my next leading lady did not have the diamonds. She was, how does anybody even live up to Marjorie Merriweather Post? How do I will never be able to top her as a woman, and I will always feel a special affinity towards Marjorie Merriweather Post. But I'm in the throes of writing my first draft of my next book, and I've told literally no one other than my literary agent and my husband. I actually am ready to say it first. I'm going to say it here first, but I haven't really shared it yet. So it's on Zoom, but otherwise we'll keep it in this room. But in the mid 19th century, there was this genius cluster that was living in Concord, Massachusetts. So it was Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they were writing and they were giving America its most, you know, celebrated decade of letters with Little Women and the Scarlet Letter, and Herman Melville was there too, and Horace Greeley, just all these amazing characters we've studied. And there was a woman at the center of it all who was writing with them and falling in and out of love with them and friends with all of them, and then had this amazing, incredible life. And yet she's not, for some reason, to this day, as well known and celebrated as they were, but she was sort of their muse and their leading lady, and her name was Margaret Fuller. And she became the first foreign correspondent she covered the Roman Revolution in Italy. She was considered the mother of feminism in America. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott wanted her to be their keynote speaker when they had their first suffragette convention. She wrote for Horace Greeley. She was maybe the inspiration for Hester Prynne when Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about the Scarlet Letter, because she was in this hot and heavy love triangle with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Louisa May Alcott wrote about 4 girls living in Concord, and she was one of 4, but she changed the big sister's name from Anna to Margaret, and Margaret Fuller was her mentor and role model, who was a little bit older than her. So I'm writing about Margaret Fuller, and it's just this fascinating life, and a little bit different decade, but just another woman who, you know, as you said, deserves all the spotlight.
Fantastic. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, you heard it here first.
Yeah. So I've literally not talked about that yet.
Well, I wanted to leave plenty of time. I know that there are a lot of questions both in this room and on Zoom, so I wanted to be sure to leave plenty of time for you all to ask your questions. So Erin, I don't know how you want to do that.
I am appearing as the man behind the curtain tonight.
Wow. Wow.
We do indeed have a few questions from Zoom, and I will ask the first one, which is, Allison, did you have the opportunity to talk to any of Marjorie Post's family members as you were creating the book?
Yes. So Kate mentioned that this was a very daunting room to speak to because it is aficionadas and aficionados of Marjorie Merriweather Post. I've been more nervous in one setting, and that was the night of my launch party in February in New York City, because Marjorie Merriweather Post's grandchild and descendants were in the room. And so what happened was I had given an early pre-publication copy I sent one to Hillwood. I was sweating bullets while I knew you were all reading it and passing it around, and to Marjorie Merriweather Post's family members. So specifically and primarily Dina Merrill's family members. And Dina Merrill's grandson, Colgate Rumbaugh, is the family historian. He has traced their lineage all the way back to Charlemagne. He is so passionate about his grandmother, Dina Merrill, and about their whole family history. He has hundreds of pages of research that he's assembled. He's done oral histories with the family members, and he just told me very, very clearly that he knows as much as there is to know, and he's very, very passionate about it. And so I was so nervous to share the book with him. And so he read the book and then told me just a little bit before that he and some of his family members were going to come to the book talk the night the book came out. So I see them walk in, and I'm trying not to hyperventilate. And I hadn't had a chance to speak to him yet because it was a large room. And at the end of the book talk, he asked for the mic and he made an announcement. And he just said, we brought my family here tonight. We're so happy that you are telling this story about my great grandmother. It's, as you said, you did not have to make up anything because her life was truly that outsized. And he loved the book, and he just appreciated that it was out there about his great grandmother. And we have since been able to connect really over email, and we've spoken quite a bit, and other members of the family as well. And that has been an incredible result to come out of this whole thing, is to connect with the members of the family, and has been a totally new experience, because the closest I've gotten to speaking to family members, I'm not in regular touch with the Swedish royal family. Those are Desiree's family members, nor am I in touch with many of Napoleon's, descendants. The closest I've gotten were Facebook messages from Benedict Arnold's descendants in Canada being like, oh yeah, we always knew it was Peggy. We always knew she was in on it. But this was such relatively recent history. And this was the first time I was writing imagined versions of conversations and scenes where people who were present are still alive and are reading the book and remember those moments. And so it was certainly an added level of pressure. And also just this driving force that I felt to just do her story justice and to honor her legacy. And I'm not writing a biography. I'm not writing a Hillwood or Rumbaugh family sanctioned biography, but I wanted to pass the credibility test, even though I'm offering readers a fictional book. And so that was a very sort of new element of pressure that I felt, but fortunately it's been good so far.
Well, I mean, I have spoken to members of the family, and they are happy. And the ones who actually, I mean, because Cole, of course, never met his great grandmother, but Nina and Stan certainly had, and Nina is actually the one who told me about the book first. And she was very supportive of it. So I thought, well, we're in good shape here.
But she said it's really awkward to read love scenes about her grandma. She did say that. That's not something she wants to picture in her head.
So Erin, are you asking, are we having, would the next question maybe come from the room?
Kate, you can go ahead and take a couple of questions from the audience in there. If you can repeat them so that our Zoom visitors can listen and hear them. And we do have a couple more in the queue, but I see lots of hands in the theater.
I knew we
would. We'll let Kate facilitate calling.
Okay.
So first I have to say I'm a nurse practitioner who's been working in the ICU during COVID. Audible books are my, walks with good books are my therapy.
Yes.
Thank you too. In the Maryland suburbs of DC, and I know Meriwether close to Lily. I did not know the story of Marjorie Meriwether Post. So learning about her, and I did. I'm on my third book of yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think when you spoke about the two tracks, and I looked at the Wikipedia summary of them, and I think the beauty that you brought to the narrative of this story is that she was married 4 times, but each time she truly was in love. And she didn't lose herself in any of those marriages, and she was, a bad ASS woman who, really was a forward thinker and did so much during World War I, building hospitals and just so many.
Can I ask, is there a question here?
Just it's a thank you, and again, how have you sort of come across each of these women that you talked about, because they're so varied in their history, but they're not women that you necessarily have learned about.
Okay,
absolutely.
so the question is, how did you
find
come
these women?
across each one of the women that you're writing? And we did hear about how you learned about Marjorie Post, but some of the others.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to you. I would say throw that back to you for being a nurse and for all of everything you do every single day for people. So my thanks goes to you. And so the question, how did I find these women? So every single one truly has been an entirely unique and random story. And I've given my agent whiplash, because then I'm like, now I'm going to write a nonfiction, and now I'm going to write a children's book. And she's like, okay, so we're going to build your career. So the Benedict Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen Arnold, is because I'm from the Hudson Valley and I grew up across from West Point. And I knew that Benedict Arnold was this local infamous figure. I had no idea that his wife even existed, even though I lived in the town and had driven by his house my whole life. And when I found out that she existed and I found out her backstory, I thought, I want to read a book about her. And there were no books about her. So I was like, that's the book I'm going to write. I'm going to write a book about her. So that was my first historical fiction book. Then with the CC books, I'm Hungarian American. Pataki is a Hungarian name. So when we would go back to Hungary or Austria or former places of the one-time Habsburg Empire, anywhere in Europe, she's this larger than life figure. She has this Princess Diana cult of personality over there. You know, you go to Vienna and you can do the Habsburg tour of the palace, of the Imperial Palace, or you can do the CC tour, and everyone does the CC tour. And I just thought, this is such a great leading lady story, but Americans just don't know her. And so I was like, that's the next book I want to write. And then again, didn't want it to be 1,000 pages. So I split it into 2 books. And then the Desiree Clary book, I'm just going quickly through each of them because I want to cover them all. The Desiree Clary book was my dad gave me the tip. My dad had seen an old movie because it had been a German book originally in the 50s by this writer, Anne-Marie Salenko, that had been adapted to a movie where Marlon Brando, I think, plays Napoleon. And my dad was watching this movie in the middle of the night, having insomnia, about this fascinating French woman in Napoleonic, the Empire. And he just, like you, went on the internet and assumed it was a made up plot. It was like, wow, this woman actually existed. And he said, you know, Allie, you love these great women from history. You should look into Desiree Clary, Napoleon's first fiance, who then went on to become Queen of Sweden. So I get these tips all the time from readers and friends and family members, but truly something about each one of these women just got its hooks in me in the way that Marjorie Merriweather Post did. And it just becomes an obsession. And then that is the story that I just know that I need to write. And it's so funny how you phrased it, because it's literally the exact way I will tell my husband. I will say, I've been bitten. And there's just no going back at that point. And you're the only other person I know who's ever worded it that way, but that is how I say it. So
I think we've probably all been bitten, right?
Yeah.
So
By Marjorie Merriweather Post, certainly.
exactly. Yes.
I was wondering, it may be in your book, but I haven't read it yet. What part did she play in the suffragette movement?
Oh,
And
yeah.
Was she influenced or did she influence President Hoover?
Can I rephrase
Absolutely.
the question?
Yes.
The question is about what role Marjorie Post played in the suffragist movement, and what were
Yeah,
her
her
influences
feelings
and
on
who
that.
did she?
Yeah. So when you see Marjorie Merriweather Post's first marriage to Edward Close beginning in the early 1900s, she really was not an outspoken feminist. She was a very traditional young bride and wife. And then for me, where I really saw her sort of starting to evolve and change was during the First World War. And Ed Close is deployed overseas, and Marjorie becomes passionate about the idea of women being able to vote. And she actually went, while Ed Close, I think, was deployed and was gone, and went to DC and met with President Wilson and became an official suffragette.
Yeah.
And I think that didn't sit well with him. That was very sort of
probably true.
controversial as he said often, it just wasn't done like that. That his wife was a political,
Right.
suffragette marching. And she was strong enough by that point to say, this is what I believe. And they sort of parted ways on that. And from everything I had read and heard was that was an era of her life where they just really did not have as much in common anymore. And part of that was
I certainly
her.
think that they grew apart when
Mhm.
they were separated, when he was in the war. And she was she gave a lot of money to the suffragist
Yeah.
movement.
Mhm.
And so she really was
Yeah.
in great support.
Yeah. And as a mother of 3 women, she became very outspoken at various points in her life
Mhm.
about speaking for the rights of women. And during World War II, she spoke about what a disaster it would be if the Nazis were to win, and just what a terrible life it would be to be a Hausfrau under this patriarchal world order that the Nazis were spewing. And she did sort of speak up for the role of women, and always kind of had, I think, her diplomatic, graceful way of speaking up,
She did.
but had her integrity, and it was clear what she believed in. And then what role did she play in the Hoover administration or in the Hoover presidency, you asked as a follow-up? Did she on Hoover? I never read anything or
No,
came across
no.
anything about their
She met with
relationship.
Wilson.
Yeah, what I did see though was just what a force she became once the Great Depression was, you know, the scourge it was that she would use the attention that was on her because the press wanted to know about her society life, and she would, you know, she really didn't want to be a tabloid darling, but she would use the interest to go and tour neighborhoods that were known as Hoovervilles, or to raise awareness for raising money for the Salvation Army, or for her soup kitchen, her food kitchen.
Yeah.
So, and then she became a big force in the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Given how important and dramatic her life is, why haven't we seen a movie? We've seen, of course,
Oh, well, we're hoping.
Netflix is
Oh my
doing
goodness,
something.
yeah.
We've seen Empress Erzsébet, of course, in
Yeah.
Assisi,
Yeah,
movie
yeah.
in Austria, like
Yeah.
a lovely movie. But why haven't we seen it?
So yeah, why haven't we seen?
Okay, good, right. Why haven't we seen a movie about Marjorie Merriweather Post? Well, when the book first came out, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe there's a chance now.
Yeah.
So,
Oh
what do
yeah,
you think?
hopefully. So what someone said to me, which is I think really great, is this could be like the American Crown, because what the Crown is it's a glimpse at all these moments in history.
Even better.
Yeah. So if there's any filmmakers, yeah, so that's what we're film groups are reading and considering, and we're going to try, we think, a mini series.
Absolutely. Don't we agree? A mini series.
And then
Yes.
Hillwood would be very busy.
Yes, indeed. Well, we would have to have group watching parties or whatever. It'd be so fun.
Yes.
Yes, question.
Can you share a little bit about your historical review and your writing process and how you gathered all your information?
Yeah. So
The question is about
yeah.
your historical review and what is your writing process?
Yes. So it's different with each book, but I would say there's always a big just sort of ingestion period up front with the research, and just reading as much as possible to absorb the facts and sort of get the idea down for like what the story is going to be. And so for this book, that was first coming here. There are amazing resources that are out. Your book wasn't out at the time,
Right.
but
Right.
Living Artfully and The Life Behind the Luxury are
Yes.
two
Yeah.
publications that are just treasures, because they are filled with photographs and handwritten letters and just so much information about Marjorie Merriweather Post's life. And then obviously when you walk here, you just feel her spirit in every room, and you can see exactly, you know, what mattered to her in her home. And then there's a really wonderful biography that's sort of just a chronological accounting that I
Right.
mentioned earlier by Nancy Rubin Stewart.
That's
that was,
upstairs.
yeah, that's in
We
the
have
bookshop.
that
And
in the
Nancy
bookshop.
is wonderful and had just
Yeah.
interviewed everyone, it seemed. And then I went to Topridge, which was her home in the Adirondacks.
Yeah.
And that was a truly remarkable experience, because it feels in many ways like a museum. It's privately owned now, but
Right.
the Crow family has left
Yeah.
her cabin very much like how they found it. And literally down to, you see her hairs in the brush, and you see drawings.
Just the one room. It's not the
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
place.
in her cabin. It's a
but-
bunch of outbuildings. It's a great
Yeah.
Adirondack camp, you know, done in the style of many, many buildings with a great lodge. But I had this amazing singular opportunity to stay in her cabin and stay there overnight. And it felt like I needed to get kicked out of a museum at a certain point.
Yeah.
I just could not believe that I was just there by myself and didn't sleep a wink, because I just was like, this was Marjorie's bed, this was Marjorie's room. And then in the
It
morning,
really is. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a total time capsule.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even
That
to the
room.
explosion of pink in her bathroom,
Yeah.
you know, as we were saying, and just waking up in the morning and hearing the loons
Yeah.
and looking out the window and thinking, this was the view that she woke up
Yeah,
to.
exactly.
And this was the place that was her refuge at so many moments in her life.
Mhm.
And I went to Battle Creek, which was Cereal City, USA, which was where it all begins with the Kellogg's and the Posts. And the SAN, and then CW Post taking his brilliant idea and running with it.
Did you
And
get to Post Texas?
I didn't make it to Post Texas. No.
Pretty far out there. but
Yes.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law would drive out to Lubbock to go to college, and she would always drive through Post. And so I took her oral accounting, and I didn't make
That's
it
probably
myself.
good enough.
But yeah, so just absorbing it. This was by far the woman that I was writing about where there was the most information. You know, the holes in the historical record can really often be where you get to play and where you get to go to work as a writer of historical fiction. This story did not really have that many holes. You know, it's a very well documented, her life. And so that was a new challenge, but also a gift in many ways, just because there was just so much information.
I'm going to interject with a question from our folks joining us from home.
Yes.
Jim asked if there are any women from history that have captured your attention, Allison, and that you'd consider writing about, but who you feel their stories are already well enough known.
That's a really great question. We don't need to repeat it, right? Because
correct.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So I always thought I would write about Alice Roosevelt because I grew as a child. I was in the New York State Executive Mansion. You know, my father was governor. Teddy Roosevelt, literally the first thing my dad did when he became governor was put up a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. It was his hero. He loved, you know, conservation and nature, and he just loved Teddy Roosevelt. My brother's name is Teddy. And we would always hear the stories of the Roosevelt kids and just what nightmares they were and how they would like swing down the banisters and how the staff was just pulling their hair out. And so I always just thought Alice Roosevelt was fascinating. And then I looked into her story and I was so surprised, but it just did not grip me in the way I thought it would in terms of where it went. I didn't feel like I connected with her for the full duration of the story.
I think she was like a really nice person.
Exactly. So what I did was I made her a character in this book because the best part, the best part of her life for me, the most interesting was her youth. And when she was like really controversial young lady in DC. And so I had her character be able to be a supporting character, and that sort of scratched that itch. But I didn't go any further. And what's so funny is she was referred to as the other Washington Monument, right? And Alice Roosevelt was. And one of my favorite things about Marjorie Merriweather Post that's relevant to where we are is the lore and the story that when she was doing all of the renovations to Hillwood and making it her own, as she tended to do with her homes, she got the tip that if she could just move the French doors or the glass panel doors in the library, there would be a perfect view of the Washington Monument. And people told her it was too hard, it was too challenging, you couldn't move those doors, there was no way to get the perfect view. And so what Marjorie did was, rather than move the doors, she just had them move the Washington Monument. And I just loved that about her, because I said, you know, yeah, that's just her, right? You know, she's gonna find a way to make it work.
All right, Erin, you want to do there or in the room?
I think we have time for about two more. So why don't I let you take one from the theater, and then we'll ask the last one from Zoom.
We have one right here.
Just really quickly, obviously there's lots of information about Mrs. Post.
Yeah.
But you drew very detailed, specific personality sketches of her four husbands.
Yeah.
What information did you use for that? Was it all indirect from her information, or did you go with their diaries?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
biographies,
Yeah.
or did you talk to their heirs?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, so it was interesting.
We have to.
Repeat it.
The question is, of course, we know a lot about Marjorie Post. What about her various husbands? How did you flesh out who they were?
And, you know, I'm writing her story. And so I will just be blatant and shameless in just admitting I was on her side, and I wrote it with a bias because I was, you know, her voice. I was trying to inhabit her story. So it was mostly from her perspective and from her biographies and her stories. With Joe Davies, I read his book, I read his letters, his journal entries, his dispatches to the State Department. Mission to Moscow is a book that anyone can read. And so I did have his voice. And then but mostly it was from her perspective. And what's been interesting after the fact is hearing family members pretty much unequivocally, I think everyone agrees that the great love of her life was E.F. Hutton. And it's just been interesting. You know, there are obviously 3 sides to every story. There's her side, his side, and the truth is probably somewhere, you know, in the middle. And so it's been interesting to hear from family members who don't just unequivocally blame E.F. Hutton, even though there was, you know, the infidelity that broke her heart. And then with Herb May, there was the infidelity that shocked her and scandalized her. But yeah, it was mostly from her perspective, and I mostly did side with her. And we root for her every time. And we're like, okay, this is going to be the one. This is going to be the happy story, the happy ending. But as she said, she had many beautiful things in life, but with love, it was not always so lucky.
Difficult.
Mhm.
So Erin?
And I will take us out with our final question this evening. But before I ask it, I do just want to thank everyone for joining us, both in the theater and virtually. Allison, we got a question from someone saying that this is the first book by you that they read, and they want to know what they should read next because they loved it. So where to start with the rest of the catalog?
Oh, goodness. Oh, I don't even know. Well, it depends how much time they have. The children's books are quick reads, so I would say that's accessible. If they like European, or if they want American, then The Trader's Wife is American. If they like European, I would say Cece or Desiree. If they want nonfiction, then I only wrote one nonfiction book. So I would tell them they should probably just read them all. That would be
Well, thank you,
Thank
Allison.
you.
We
Thank
all
you.
really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me.
And we all want to see the mini series.
Yes. I know, right?
So tell us who to write. So make it happen.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.